That is what it meant to live on Cadia, in the final days before its fall. The fortress world had stood for 10,000 years, a bastion of defiance against the endless dark. Every child born beneath its iron skies was raised with a single truth: the eye must never spread. For generations, that truth was enough to bind them, to harden their hearts, to forge them into the walls that held back the storm. But the eye never sleeps. Cadia was not a paradise. It was a wound cauterized by duty. The air carried the tang of oil and dust, the echo of marching boots and the whisper of prayers to a distant emperor. Every street, every trench, every fortress spire bore the weight of history, the ghosts of victories so costly they blurred into tragedy. Yet somehow, life continued. People laughed. They drank their rationed amasec beneath dim lights and told stories about ancestors who had bled for this same soil. They spoke of faith, of sacrifice, of a war that never truly ended. And above them, the eye of terror watched, a red, bleeding sky that pulsed like a dying star. The people had learned not to look at it too long. They said it looked back. In those last quiet days, there was something strange in the air. Even the veterans felt it, that silence before the thunder. The drills went on as always, the officers barked orders, the soldiers trained until exhaustion blurred the edges of thought. Yet beneath it all, something whispered through the cracks in reality. The warp was shifting, the storm was breathing. There was a woman named Lisa Ardent, commander of the 102nd Cadian Shock Troops. She had seen 30 years of battle across the Segmentum Obscurus. She had watched comrades vanish into the warp, heard the screams of the damned carried by radio static. But even she could not name the unease she felt now. It was not fear of battle, Cadia knew war. It was something older. It was the feeling that the world itself was beginning to forget how to hold together. At night, when the barracks lights dimmed and the endless march of duty paused, she would look toward the shimmering horizon, where the eye's glow bled into the void, and she would whisper to herself a forbidden thought: what if it's already too late? In the cathedrals, priests of the ecclesiarchy preached that the emperor watches all, that his light would never fade. But even their voices had changed. The sermons grew quieter, the pauses longer. Sometimes, mid-prayer, the candles would flicker and extinguish without wind. The faithful said it was a test. The skeptics said nothing at all. Then came the dreams. At first, just whispers, soldiers waking in the dark, breathing fast, unable to remember what they'd seen. But soon, whole platoons began to speak of the same vision: a black sun, rising above Cadia's fortress lines, and the sound of 1,000 drums beating beneath the earth. Lisa wrote it off as fatigue. But when her Vox officer started muttering in his sleep, words in a language no human throat should form, she stopped pretending. Something was calling to them. Something vast. And still, the days went on. Convoys rumbled through dust-streaked roads. The commissariat drilled order into the restless. High Command sent encoded reports full of reassurances, reinforcements en route, all sectors stable, morale high. Lies, she thought, even then. But lies were a kind of mercy. In orbit, the defense fleet glittered like a crown of iron teeth, countless ships, each one bristling with hope and desperation. They said Cadia was impregnable. They said the fortress would stand until the stars went cold. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor. The first sign was almost gentle. A distortion in the heavens, like the shimmer of heat over sand. Then a sound, low, resonant, like the echo of distant thunder. The astropaths screamed that night. Every one of them. Some clawed their eyes out. Some whispered names that had not been spoken since the Great Heresy. And when their voices fell silent, something else began to speak through them. It said only one thing, over and over, through bleeding throats and broken minds. The eye is open. And from that moment on, Cadia was no longer the fortress that held the line. It was the stage upon which the galaxy would remember how to fall. That was how the fall of Cadia began. Not with fire, not with screams, but with a pulse. A vibration deep within the crust of the world, like a heartbeat echoing from the planet's core. At first, the soldiers ignored it. Planets quaked, machines rumbled, life went on. But when the pulse returned, stronger, rhythmic, like drums beneath the soil, even the hardened veterans stopped pretending not to hear. They said it was the planet remembering its own death before it happened. If you stay with me until the end of this story, you'll learn something the history books never tell. Not about weapons, not about tactics, but about what it means to believe while watching everything you've ever known unravel. It's a truth worth hearing, if you can bear it. The first shatter came from the sky. When the fleet reported the warp rippling near the edge of the system, they thought it was another storm. Cadians had seen warp turbulence before. They had lived beside it for millennia. But this was different. The void itself was bleeding. Colors that should never exist streaked across the stars, twisting space into impossible shapes. Vox channels filled with static and whispers, entire battalions lost contact in seconds. Then the first ships appeared. The despoiler had come. Abaddon the War Master, the shadow of Horus himself, had brought with him not an army, but an apocalypse. The fleet that tore through the warp was endless. Demon engines, corrupted cruisers, black-armored legions chanting in languages long buried. And behind them, the Eye of Terror burned brighter than ever before, as if the universe itself had decided that Cadia's time was over. On the ground, Lisa Ardent felt the moment they broke through. She didn't need sensors or reports. The sky told her everything, clouds twisting into crimson spirals, lightning that screamed instead of thundered, and that pulse, that terrible pulse, now shaking the world itself. Orders came down from the Kazarkan command, hold the line. Simple words, impossible meaning. Cadians had been told to hold before, against orcs, against traitors, against the crawling nightmares of the warp. But this was no battle to be won. This was a wall standing before a tidal wave. Lisa gathered her troops, voices steady though eyes betrayed the truth. We hold, she said, because there is no other choice. And for a moment, the world seemed to listen. The first bombardment lasted 3 days. Entire cities turned to dust. Vox lines burned out from psychic interference. Across the fortress lines, soldiers fought without orders, guided only by instinct, training, and faith. Every shell that fell carried whispers from the warp, voices that promised mercy if they would just surrender. They didn't. On the fourth day, the sky split open. A ship unlike any other emerged from the rift, massive, grotesque, its hull a cathedral of rusted iron and flesh. The Planet Killer. Its weapon ignited, a beam of impossible light that erased entire battalions in silence. Those who survived said the light wasn't heat, it was memory itself being burned away. Yet even as the world began to break, Cadia refused to yield. The soldiers fought not because they thought they would win, but because someone had to make the galaxy remember that humanity still existed. In the command bunker, Lisa's hands trembled over the Vox. The messages coming in were madness, fragments of voices, names, screams, prayers. Somewhere above the chaos, the fleet commander's final words echoed through the static. The line is broken. The sky belongs to the eye. Lisa turned toward her troops, eyes hollow but fierce. Then we fight in the dark, she whispered. Outside, the ground cracked open. The pulse stopped. For a moment, there was silence, deep, total, unnatural. Then, the world began to scream. That's what Cadia became in those final weeks, a prayer whispered through the roar of artillery. The fortress world had endured the impossible before. It had stared into the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years and not blinked. But this time, the eye wasn't watching. It was reaching. The fabric of reality tore open in shimmering scars across the sky, and from those wounds poured the unthinkable, the armies of the warp, the chosen of chaos, and horrors that had no name, only hunger. They came like a tide of living nightmares. Demon engines screamed through the smoke, their metal bones wrapped in flesh that pulsed like it remembered being alive. The skies were fire, the ground molten glass, yet still the Cadians stood. Every soldier became a story. Every trench became a grave waiting for its owner. Lisa Ardent barely slept. The days bled together, battles without dawns or sunsets, just flickering hours of survival. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, had become something else now, quiet, deliberate, heavy with exhaustion and defiance. She no longer spoke of victory. She spoke of remembering. Every second we stand, she told her troops, the Imperium breathes. In the distance, the Black Legion descended, their black and gold armor glimmering through ash and lightning. They did not march, they advanced like executioners, each step deliberate, inevitable. Behind them, the traitor guard swarmed, once human soldiers now hollowed by chaos, their eyes empty, their faith consumed. Cadia was bleeding. Entire regiments vanished overnight, communications fractured. The planet's crust buckled under the strain of the warp's pressure. Vox transmissions carried whispers instead of orders. Some soldiers swore they could hear the planet screaming beneath their boots. And yet, the Cadians didn't run. They couldn't. The idea simply didn't exist. To flee was to deny the very purpose of their existence. So they fought, and they died, and they fought again. There were moments, tiny, fleeting, when it seemed as though they might turn the tide. On the fifth night of the siege, the 8th Cadian Armored Division pushed the enemy back from Khazar Kraf. Lisa led the charge herself, her command tank a moving shrine of defiance. She could feel the heat of the warp fire through the hull, hear the screams of the damned echoing in the static of the comms. When her gunners fired, she whispered a prayer under her breath. Not to the Emperor, she wasn't sure he still listened, but to Cadia itself. By dawn, the ground was a wasteland of blackened steel and red dust. The victory lasted 4 hours. Then the counterattack came. From orbit, traitor ships began to fall, not landing, but crashing, deliberately, their twisted hulks turning into craters of fire that birthed new armies upon impact. Each wreck became a fortress, each explosion a new wound in the planet's skin. And from the heart of the chaos, a new voice began to speak. Across every channel, every frequency, it whispered, deep, resonant, calm. Cadia has stood for 10,000 years. It ends tonight. Abaddon had come. Lisa heard the voice and felt the air itself tighten around her. Somewhere deep inside, a part of her wanted to believe. It wasn't real, that it was another trick of the warp. But when the black sun rose above the fortress lines, she knew the truth. The end wasn't coming. It was already here. By then, Cadia's surface was fractured into continents of ruin. The once great fortress cities were nothing but broken towers leaning against the storm. The sky wept ash. The air was poison. The oceans boiled. Yet still, human hearts beat beneath the armor. Still, soldiers whispered to each other in the dark, "We stand." There was no command structure anymore. No reinforcements. Just fragments of regiments holding what ground they could. Every trench was its own world now. And in those final days, Cadia became something greater than a planet. It became an idea. An idea that even gods could bleed if humanity refused to kneel. But ideas can't stop a world from breaking. The planet killer fired again, and this time, the beam struck deep, into the heart of Cadia itself. The crust buckled. The ground rose and fell like a wave. Mountains split open. Entire fortresses sank into molten earth. Lisa watched it happen from the last command bastion. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, her gloved hands trembling, and whispered the same words over and over again. Cadia stands. Cadia stands. Cadia stands. Even as the horizon folded in fire, she didn't stop. Even as her voice broke, she kept saying it. And somewhere, through the warp, through the screaming void, perhaps even the gods heard her. The world had begun to come apart. You could feel it, in the tremor of the air, in the slow shudder of the earth beneath the boots of soldiers who refused to fall. The crust groaned like a dying beast. The sky was a storm of color and flame, torn open by the will of gods. Reality itself was thin, stretched, wounded. The eye of terror had widened, not just in the heavens, but in the hearts of men. And yet, through it all, Cadia still stood. The last bastions of the Cadian shock troops had retreated to the ruins of Khazar Myrick, a fortress reduced to little more than shattered walls and molten stone. Commander Lisa Ardent stood at the center of what remained, her armor scorched, her eyes hollow, her soul anchored to one thought: we hold. Reports from orbit were a litany of despair. The Imperial fleet was in fragments, their ships burning in silence across the void. Abaddon's forces now covered half the planet, their banners of chaos fluttering over the bones of a world that had never known surrender. But even then, the defenders refused to yield. In the tunnels beneath the ruins, survivors whispered prayers over broken weapons, patched armor with bloodied cloth, and spoke to one another as if the Emperor could still hear them. Each name spoken was a promise. Each breath was rebellion. Lisa moved among them, her voice a calm echo through the chaos. We hold the line not because we think we can win, she told them, but because someone has to remember that we tried. Outside, the sky tore open again. Another ripple in the fabric of reality, another scar across the heavens. And from that wound descended something so vast that even the demons fell silent, the Blackstone Fortress will of eternity. Its fall was not a crash but a judgment. The impact split Cadia's crust. The shockwave was felt across continents. Oceans vaporized, mountains bowed. The fortress world's spine broke with a sound that no mortal throat could describe. The ground beneath Lisa's feet became a living thing, shifting, twisting, collapsing. Entire divisions vanished into fire. And in that moment, she understood the truth. Cadia would not fall because of Abaddon. Cadia would fall because it had done its duty for too long. The universe had finally come to collect the debt. Still, she fought. Through the smoke and heat and death, she rallied whoever still breathed. The wounded, the broken, the half-conscious, all gathered behind her as if drawn by the last light of something pure. She raised her last pistol, though it was nearly drained, and shouted into the storm. Cadia stands. For a heartbeat, the world answered. A surge of energy rippled through the ground. The shattered pylons, ancient and forgotten relics of another age, began to awaken. Green light flared through the cracks in the stone, pulsing like veins beneath the planet's skin. The pylons, those silent sentinels that had always held the eye at bay, were reaching for something, trying to resist the warp's tide one last time. Reality flickered. Time fractured. For a single, impossible moment, Cadia resisted the gods themselves. But the effort was too much. The planet screamed, not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. Its core ruptured. The magnetic poles tore themselves apart. The light of the pylons went dark. The Blackstone Fortress cracked the surface, tearing open the mantle. The gravity failed. Entire continents lifted, crumbled, and fell into the void. The world's oceans rose as burning mist, and the very atmosphere was ripped away by the warp's hunger. Lisa stood at the brink, her armor melting, her lungs filled with smoke and dust. Around her, the last soldiers of Cadia, bloodied, silent, defiant, formed a line that would never break again. She looked up into the sky one last time. And there it was, the eye of terror, open wide, endless, watching. It had always been there, waiting. She smiled, faintly. Not in madness, not in despair, but in pride. Then let the galaxy remember this, she whispered. If Cadia falls, it falls standing. The world beneath her split apart. The horizon folded into itself. And in a moment of light and silence, Cadia was gone. The fortress world that had held the line for 10,000 years had fallen. But the echo of its defiance would ripple across the stars for eternity. That was the sound that lingered after Cadia fell. There were no screams now. No thunder of cannons. No clash of steel or roar of engines. Only drifting ash, fragments of armor, and the slow, eternal whisper of a world that had done its duty. In the void where Cadia once stood, debris shimmered like frozen tears, a halo of ruin orbiting the ghost of a planet. Each fragment carried the echo of 10,000 years of defiance. Some said you could still hear them, faintly, through the static of long-dead Vox channels, voices repeating the words that defined them. Cadia stands. The survivors were few, scattered across space in crippled ships, adrift and silent. Some were rescued by Imperial vessels, others vanished into the warp storms that followed. None of them ever truly left Cadia behind. It followed them, in dreams, in silence, in the weight behind their eyes when they spoke of home. Commander Lisa Ardent was among them. She woke aboard a Medicae ship days later, though days had no meaning anymore. The stars outside the viewport were wrong, twisted, rearranged. Reality itself had shifted from the force of the planet's death. Her body was broken, her armor gone, her world erased. But her spirit burned. They told her Cadia was gone, that the planet had been swallowed whole, torn apart by the gravity well of the eye. She didn't answer. She just stared at the stars, the same stars her ancestors had fought beneath, and whispered, "Then it still stands, somewhere." Because that was the truth. Cadia had not died. It had transcended. In the archives of the Imperium, scribes wrote of the fall as a tragedy, a loss, a wound that would never heal. But those who were there, the soldiers, the priests, the children who grew up beneath fortress walls, they knew better. Cadia's death was not defeat. It was sacrifice. And sacrifice is the oldest kind of victory. Across the galaxy, word of its fall spread like fire. Whole worlds wept. Regiments swore oaths in its name. Even among the stars of chaos, whispers rose in uneasy reverence, for Cadia had done what no god ever expected. It had defied destiny. For 10,000 years, it had stood between mankind and madness. And even in death, it did not fall quietly. There's a saying that grew from that day, not from command, not from scripture, but from the lips of those who refused to forget. The world is gone, but the line still stands. Generations later, soldiers would paint the words Cadia stands on their armor, on the sides of their ships, on the banners they carried into hopeless wars. It became more than a phrase. It became a promise. Somewhere, Lisa's descendants would take up that promise. They would fight under different skies, on different worlds, facing different horrors. But in the silence between battles, they would remember that once, a world held the line so the rest of the galaxy could live. And sometimes, in the quiet of deep space, the Vox would crackle for just a moment. Static, faint, distant. Then, a voice, barely a whisper. Cadia stands. And for those who heard it, sleep came differently that night, deeper, calmer, touched by something ancient and proud. Because Cadia may have fallen, but its echo still lives in the heartbeat of every soldier who refuses to bow. Cadia's fall left more than silence, it left a resonance that traveled with the currents of the galaxy, touching hearts and minds that had never known its walls. The survivors drifted among the stars, carrying shards of their home like sacred relics. Their ships were battered, their supplies low, their numbers few, yet in every frozen chamber, in every quiet watch, there was a whisper. A reminder of something that once stood unbroken, something that refused to die. Lisa Ardent wandered the Medicae decks, her hands tracing the edge of a console, remembering the touch of stone walls, the weight of a laspistol, the cry of the planet as it broke beneath the Blackstone fortress. She thought of her soldiers, friends, comrades, ghosts, and she whispered their names into the emptiness. The void answered not with sound, but with stillness. It was in that stillness that the first stirrings of legend began. Stories of Cadia's final stand spread faster than any fleet could carry them. They reached distant systems, worlds untouched by the eye's hunger. Pilots told of entire convoys surrendering in awe of the steadfastness of a planet that stood until the very end. Histories were rewritten in hushed voices, in moments when the galaxy dared to dream of courage against impossible odds. And the whispers did not fade. In the deep, uncharted reaches of space, small fleets of human refugees began to call themselves the children of Cadia. They rebuilt what they could, not with walls of stone, but with hearts hardened by memory. Every battle they fought, Every hardship they endured, they carried the echo of a world that had shown them how to resist, how to stand, even when the stars themselves seemed determined to fall. Lisa's name became a symbol. She was no longer just a commander, she was the embodiment of a promise. A promise that wherever despair reigned, there could still be defiance. And in the quiet corners of the galaxy, the soldiers she once led told stories of her courage, of how she faced the impossible, not with hope, but with unflinching resolve. Time moved differently after Cadia. Generations grew up in the shadow of its memory, yet they remembered the sound of the pulse, the shimmer of the warp, the distant, impossible cries of a planet that refused to bow. Children were raised not on tales of victories, but on lessons of endurance, that the measure of a person, a regiment, a world, was not how it fell, but how it stood before it fell. Even the enemies who had witnessed its destruction spoke of it in silence. The Black Legion, the demons of the warp, even the cold calculation of chaos itself had learned, in some deep, unspoken way, that Cadia's defiance could not be erased. The universe had witnessed what steadfastness could achieve, and for the first time, even the infinite darkness hesitated. Some nights, Lisa would close her eyes and hear the pulse again. Not loud, not terrifying, but faint, steady, like a heartbeat beneath the void. And in that moment, she knew that Cadia's spirit still moved, still lived, still reached across the stars to those willing to listen. The galaxy was quieter now, but it was not empty. It carried the memory of a world that had given everything to hold the line. And as long as someone, somewhere, remembered, Cadia would never truly fall. For those who survived Cadia, memory was both. It carried the pain of loss, the weight of duty, and the quiet comfort of a world that had stood when nothing else could. Every survivor bore the imprint of that last stand. Soldiers who had once shouted orders now moved silently, tracing the lines of their ships, the instruments of war, as though by touching them they could feel Cadia's pulse again. They remembered the earth trembling beneath their boots, the shriek of falling artillery, and the silence that came after. And in that silence, they found themselves speaking aloud to ghosts, friends, comrades, even enemies who had perished alongside them. Lisa Ardent walked among them still. Though her body was scarred and her spirit frayed, she carried a quiet authority that needed no words. She told stories to the younger soldiers, those born after Cadia's fall, stories not of heroics but of endurance. She spoke of the trenches that had been swallowed by fire, of the pylons that had flared one final time, of the moment when a planet whispered defiance to the void. They may have broken Cadia, she said softly, her gaze lost in the distant stars, but they will never break what we carry in our hearts. Memory, in the aftermath of devastation, became a living thing. It bent time and space, linking those who remembered across the galaxy. On distant worlds, in cramped bunkers and sprawling citadels, survivors would awake in the night to whispers, fragments of cadences, echoes of the pulse that once shook the planet, cries of, "Cadia stands," carried on the void's breath. Some called it madness, others called it devotion, but all who heard it understood, the past was not dead. It lived, breathing in the hearts of those who refused to forget. Even the quietest moments carried weight. A child aboard a refugee ship would ask why their parents spoke of places they had never seen, of heroes who were now only names. And the answer was simple, to teach them what endurance meant. To remind them that standing firm, even against the impossible, was itself a form of victory. And in the far reaches of the warp, there were those who remembered Cadia as well. The demons who had claimed the planet carried fragments of its defiance in their twisted memories, and even they recoiled at its echo. They learned that courage could pierce through the endless darkness, that the human spirit, when concentrated, could leave scars where even the gods could not erase. Time flowed onward, but the shadow of Cadia stretched longer than most could see. Ships bore its name, regiments carried its banners, songs were written of its final days, not in triumph but in remembrance. For even in loss, there is dignity, and even in destruction, there can be purpose. And as long as one living soul remembered the pulse beneath the ground, the whisper of the pylons, the courage of those who stood against the eye itself, Cadia remained. Not as a world, not as a fortress, but as a symbol, eternal, unyielding, haunting in its beauty. That is the nature of the warp. That is the nature of loss. That is what followed Cadia's fall. With the planet gone, a wound opened in reality. The eye of terror pulsed wider, its tendrils reaching into space like hungry fingers, testing the limits of everything it had once been held from. Ships traversing nearby systems reported strange anomalies, stars flickering out, comets bending as though aware, radios singing with voices that had no origin. The universe remembered Cadia, and in remembering, it began to change. Survivors felt it first in dreams. Lisa Ardent, though far from the ruins, woke to visions of burning plains and trembling skies. She heard the pulse again, softer this time, yet deeper, as though the planet was calling out from another dimension. She saw faces of soldiers long gone, felt their hands clutching hers in the darkness. And through it all, a single, impossible truth whispered in her mind: Cadia had not fallen into nothingness. It had become part of something larger, something eternal. Across the stars, entire fleets reported strange phenomena. Navigators trembled, astropaths screamed, and psychers fainted as fragments of Cadia's defiance echoed across the warp. Even the minions of chaos seemed uneasy, as if a memory could wound them more than any weapon. And in those moments, the galaxy itself seemed to pause, acknowledging that even in destruction, there can exist a force that bends destiny. Yet the warp is not kind. It does not grant comfort. It whispers, it twists, it tempts. The survivors, the children of Cadia, were not immune. Dreams became nightmares. Stars no longer seemed constant. Every light in the void held a question, every shadow a warning. They could feel Cadia's pulse beneath their own hearts, intertwined with the rhythm of the warp, and it was both reassurance and torment. Lisa understood then that survival was not simply staying alive. It was keeping the memory intact. Every whispered story, every recounting of a fallen friend, every silent oath to stand against the impossible, these were shields against the madness that now spread across the galaxy. And the galaxy needed them. Because in the absence of Cadia, the balance had shifted. Systems that had relied on its steadfastness found themselves vulnerable. The Imperium, fractured and terrified, reached out into the void for something to anchor its hope. And the only thing that remained, the only thing that could, was the story of the fortress that had once held the line. There was power in memory. Power in courage remembered, in resistance chronicled. Cadia had fallen, yes, but it had left behind a veil, a presence woven into the warp itself. To those who listened, who believed, it was a shield. To those who doubted, a haunting echo that could not be ignored. The survivors carried this knowledge in silence. They whispered to one another in the dim corridors of their ships, careful to keep the truth alive. And though the galaxy around them was changing, unstable, and dark, they remembered that even in the endless night, there was a pulse that had never stopped. A pulse that would guide them. A pulse that would teach them. A pulse that would ensure that Cadia, though physically gone, was eternal. Cadia was gone, yet its heartbeat traveled across the stars, carried not in stone or steel, but in memory, in stories, in every soldier who refused to forget. The galaxy had changed. Systems that had relied on Cadia's steadfast walls found themselves exposed, trembling under threats that had once seemed distant. Armies reorganized, fleets were rerouted, and yet through the chaos, a singular truth persisted. The line had been held, if only for long enough to leave an imprint that could not be erased. The children of Cadia, those survivors and their descendants, became wandering beacons of that memory. They carried the stories of trenches swallowed by fire, of pylons flaring one last time, of soldiers standing against impossible odds. They bore the scars of war on their bodies, but on their souls, they carried the fire of a planet that had refused to kneel. Lisa Ardent, now older, no longer commanded armies in battle. Instead, She taught, she guided, she whispered the lessons of endurance. Remember, she would tell her students, it is not victory that defines you, but the courage to hold the line when everything else falls away. The children, literal and metaphorical, listened. They memorized the stories, repeated the oaths, and etched the phrases into every corner of their lives. Cadia stands. It became a mantra, a reminder, a promise to the universe that even when the impossible arrives, humanity can endure. And endure it did. Across the Imperium, new regiments took the name of Cadia, their banners painted with the words of a fallen world. Even those born long after the planet's destruction felt the weight of its legacy. They trained, they fought, they marched with the echo of a planet's defiance guiding them. Yet the galaxy also remembered the cost. Tales of burned cities, of soldiers swallowed by fire and warp, of the planet's crust breaking under unimaginable pressure, these stories served as warnings. Courage alone was not enough. Vigilance, sacrifice, and unity were the shields that Cadia had provided. And in the quiet moments, when ships drifted through empty space or battalions rested beneath alien skies, the survivors would hear the whisper again. Not in sound, but in feeling. The pulse, the heartbeat of Cadia, eternal, reminding them of their duty. Even the eye of terror, endless, consuming, infinite, seemed to hesitate when it encountered this legacy. Demons recoiled, fleets faltered, and for brief moments, the galaxy glimpsed what it meant for courage to transcend the material. Cadia's fall had not been the end. It had been the beginning of a story that would shape generations, a line that would ripple through history, a symbol that would never die. So long as there were those willing to remember, to stand, to fight even when hope seemed gone, Cadia lived. Not as a planet, not as a fortress, but as an idea, unbroken, unyielding, eternal. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that even when everything falls away, the line you hold, the courage you embody, the memory you preserve, those are the things that shape the universe itself. That is the pulse of Cadia, eternal, unbroken, a rhythm that moves across the stars long after the world itself has been erased. Even in death, Cadia breathed. Its memory lingered in the corridors of shattered ships, in the silence between battles, in the whispered oaths of soldiers who would never forget. To those who listened carefully, it was more than sound, it was guidance, comfort, and a warning all at once. The universe had taken the planet, torn it apart with fire and gravity, consumed it with the eye of terror. Yet what it could not take was the essence of its people, their courage, their defiance, their unyielding will. That essence had seeped into the warp, into the hearts of survivors, and into the very fabric of the galaxy. Lisa Ardent, now a figure both mortal and legendary, sat quietly aboard a refugee vessel drifting through endless stars. She closed her eyes and felt it, the pulse beneath the void, steady and resolute. It was not loud, it was not violent, it did not scream or roar. It simply was, and in that being, there was peace. The children of Cadia, the regiments that bore its name, the countless souls scattered across the Imperium, all were bound by that pulse. It taught them resilience, whispered lessons of endurance, and reminded them that even when the impossible strikes, the line can still stand. And so, the galaxy carried on. Stars were born and died, empires rose and fell, wars raged across worlds unseen. Yet somewhere in the midst of it all, that steady heartbeat persisted. It was in the quiet moments, the long nights, the solitary watches. It was a reminder that even when worlds crumble, courage can endure. In the warp, the demons felt it too, not as fear, but as respect. Even darkness recognized light that refuses to die. Cadia's story had become more than history. It had become legend, myth, and finally, a truth too powerful to be erased. So when you drift in silence, when you look up into the endless night and feel small, remember this, the pulse of Cadia moves through the stars. It moves through the hearts of those who remember. And it will never stop. The line holds, even when everything else falls away. And in that enduring rhythm, there is comfort. There is peace. There is a story that will never end.